Helen Leland pressed her lips together so hard they went white, and she did not look at Monroe Lockhart when she said it. She looked instead at the open door of the Sweetwater station, at the 4 o'clock light cutting across the plank floor in long golden bars, at the wagon sitting outside with everything she owned packed into a single trunk and 2 carpet bags, at the road that curved north toward Cheyenne, and the life she had decided she was going back to, even though that life had nearly destroyed her once already. "I know you are not asking me to stay," she said. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. She felt the ripples of them move outward, felt them reach Monroe where he stood behind her, felt the way his breath changed, the way the particular silence he carried shifted into something rower and less contained. She had given him every opportunity. She had lingered 3 days past the date she had told herself she would leave. She had found reasons to walk past his land office on errands that required no such route. She had sat at the supper table of the Sweetwater boarding house every evening for 6 weeks and watched his hands when he spoke, the way they moved with a precision and a care that undid something in her chest every single time. She had waited. She had hoped. And he had said nothing. She was not a woman who could wait for a man to find his courage when her own life was evaporating. She was not that kind of woman. She had told herself that 100 times, so she had packed the trunk. She had paid Mrs. Donahue through the end of the week. She had arranged passage north. And now he was standing behind her, and the door was open, and the wagon was waiting, and she had said the words she had expected to say alone, expected to say into empty air. And instead she had said them to the charged and crackling silence of Monroe Lockhart, standing 6 feet away with something in his face she had not known how to read until this exact moment. "Then I am asking now," he said. Helen turned around. He was standing with one hand braced against the doorframe of the interior hall, as though he had caught himself mid-stride, as though he had been moving toward her and had stopped himself and then changed his mind about stopping. His jaw was tight. His gray eyes were fixed on her with an expression she had never seen on any man's face before, an expression that was part desperation and part resolve, and something underneath both of those things that she did not yet have the right word for. "Monroe," she said. "Don't go," he said. "I should have said it 3 weeks ago. I should have said it the first week if I'm being honest with myself, which I have not been for a long time. But I am asking you now, Helen, stay." The wagon waited in the afternoon light. The road curved north. And Helen Leland, who had made up her mind so firmly it felt like stone, felt every certain thing inside her begin to soften at the edges. This is where the story really begins. Not at the door, not at the wagon, not even at the 6 weeks in Sweetwater that led them there. It begins 4 months earlier, in the spring of 1882, when a woman running from a ruined life rode into the Wyoming Territory on a bone-rattling stagecoach and stepped out into the dust and the wind and the impossible sky of a frontier town with nothing but a letter of introduction and a desperate, secret hope. The year was 1882, and the Wyoming Territory was a place of contradictions. The Transcontinental Railroad had been complete for 13 years, and yet the land between the rail lines was still raw and untamed in a way that swallowed people whole. Towns like Sweetwater had sprung up along the rivers and the cattle routes, settlements of wood and determination, full of people who had come west to escape something or find something, and frequently both at once. Helen Leland had come to escape. She was 28 years old, which in the parlance of her time was a perilous age for an unmarried woman, though she had been married once, and that was precisely the wound she was running from. Not running from the absence of a husband. Running from the consequence of having chosen the wrong one. His name had been Gerald Fitch, and she had married him at 23 in St. Louis because he had been charming and prosperous and her father had approved, and because at 23 she had not yet learned that charm and character were not the same thing, and that prosperity built on other people's suffering had a way of collapsing suddenly and taking everyone near it down into the rubble. Gerald Fitch had been a land speculator of the worst variety. He had taken investment money from families who trusted him, families who were putting in their life savings on the promise of western land parcels that Gerald had either misrepresented or did not actually own. When the scheme unraveled in the winter of 1880, Gerald had disappeared to parts unknown, leaving Helen behind with his debts, his scandal, and a reputation so damaged in St. Louis society that she could not walk down Olive Street without seeing the particular cold blankness that came over people's faces when they recognized her name. She had not known what Gerald was doing. That was the truth she had lived with for 2 years, a truth she could not make anyone in St. Louis believe. She had been his wife in name and in the practical arrangements of their household, and she had not been permitted entry into his business dealings, which had seemed appropriate at the time because that was simply how things were done, and now seemed like the greatest naivety of her life. She had tried to stay. She had found work as a seamstress and then as a schoolteacher's assistant. She had lived in 2 rooms above a milliner's shop, and she had been careful and quiet, and she had kept her head down. But St. Louis had a long memory, and Gerald Fitch's victims had faces and voices, and eventually the accumulated weight of being looked at like a suspect in her own life had become more than she could carry. Her cousin Adeline had written from Cheyenne. There was work in the Wyoming Territory. Women were needed everywhere, as teachers and as capable people who could manage the practical affairs of frontier businesses. Adeline had a friend who ran a boarding house in a smaller settlement called Sweetwater, a Mrs. Donahue, who needed someone to keep accounts and manage correspondence, and generally impose order on the chaotic enterprise of running an establishment in a town that was still working out what it intended to be. Helen had taken the last of her savings, purchased a stagecoach ticket as far west as her money would carry her, and arrived in Sweetwater on a Tuesday in late March 1882 with 2 carpet bags and a trunk and no plan beyond the immediate one. Mrs. Donahue had met her at the stage stop. She was a broad woman of about 50 with sharp blue eyes and a competence about her that Helen had found immediately reassuring. She had looked Helen up and down once, asked 2 practical questions about her experience with ledger books and her handwriting, and pronounced the arrangement satisfactory. Helen had been given a room on the upper floor of the Sweetwater boarding house, a room with a window that looked out over the main street, and she had sat on the edge of the narrow bed that first evening and breathed in the particular smell of the Wyoming spring through the open window, sage and cold air and the distant, clean scent of the Sweetwater River, and she had thought, "No one here knows my name." It had been the most extraordinary feeling of freedom she had ever experienced. She had met Monroe Lockhart on her 4th day in Sweetwater. She had been crossing the main street with a stack of ledger books that Mrs. Donahue needed taken to the mercantile for some correction in a previous order, and she had miscalculated the distance between the wooden walkway and the street's surface, which was muddy with recent rain and ridged with wagon wheel tracks, and her boot had caught in one of those ridges, and she had gone down on one knee in the mud with the ledger books scattered in a fan around her. She had been mortified. She had been kneeling there in the cold mud trying to decide whether to gather the books or stand up first when a pair of worn leather boots had appeared in her peripheral vision, and a hand had appeared in front of her face. She had taken it, strong grip, warm even through both their gloves, and she had come upright in one smooth pull. "Thank you," she had said, looking up. He was taller than she had expected from the boots. Broad through the shoulders, lean through the middle, with a face that was angular and weathered in the way that Wyoming made faces, all planes and shadows, with gray eyes that were watchful and serious, and currently performing a rapid assessment of whether she was hurt. "Are you all right?" he said. "Perfectly," she said, which was not entirely true because her knee hurt and her pride was damaged, but the mud damage to her dress was more pressing in the immediate term. "The mud's particular bad this time of year," he said. He had already moved to collect the ledger books without being asked, stacking them with a neat efficiency, handing them back to her in a tidy pile. "So I have discovered," she said. He had a hat, the brim shadowing his face, and he tipped it slightly in the way of someone who had been taught manners and kept the habit of them. "Monroe Lockhart," he said, "I run the land office 2 doors down. Helen Leland," she said. "I am keeping accounts for Mrs. Donahue." Something had moved across his face then, a small and subtle thing, there and gone quickly enough that she almost missed it. She had not known at the time what to make of it, though she would think about it later. "Welcome to Sweetwater, Miss Leland," he said. She had corrected him without thinking. "Mrs. Leland," she said, and then immediately wished she hadn't, because his expression had become carefully neutral in a way that told her the distinction mattered and that he was recalibrating. "Mrs. Leland," he said, "I hope the territory treats you well." He had walked on. She had stood in the street with her ledger books and mud on her dress and watched him go, and then she had turned and continued toward the mercantile, and told herself firmly that the particular way her heart was beating was simply the result of the exertion of nearly falling. She had believed herself, for about 2 days. The boarding house at which Helen lived and worked was the social center of Sweetwater in the way that such establishments tended to be in frontier towns. It was the largest and most reputable place to take meals, and in the evenings its parlor was open to any resident who wished to sit and read or play cards or simply exist in the company of other people at the end of a long western day. Monroe Lockhart took supper there 3 evenings a week. Helen had learned this on her 2nd week, when she had been helping Mrs. Donahue lay the supper table and had looked up to find him coming through the door, and had done a fairly good job of appearing to have no particular reaction to this information. He sat at the end of the table nearest the window. He was polite and quiet, with a dry wit that surfaced occasionally in conversation and made the other boarders laugh. He read in the parlor afterward when he stayed, a book that Helen had been too far away to read the spine of, though she had tried. He did not seek out her company particularly, but neither did he avoid it, and in the specific social geometry of a boarding house supper table, they were often near each other, often in the same conversations. She had learned things about him in pieces, the way you learned things about people in those close frontier quarters where privacy was valued, and therefore not much explanation was volunteered, but observation was possible. She learned that he had come to Sweetwater 4 years ago from Colorado, though the specific reasons he had left Colorado were not something she had access to. She learned that the land office he ran served a 3-county area, and that he was considered honest, which in a territory full of land claims and competing interests was a reputation worth more than most. She learned that he had a horse named Compass that he rode out of town 2 mornings a week to survey properties, and that he came back from these rides looking more settled and less guarded than he looked in town, as though the open country did something necessary for him. She also learned, from Mrs. Donahue, delivered one afternoon in the offhand way of someone who was not entirely sure they were imparting relevant information, that Monroe Lockhart had been engaged once, about 2 years prior, to a woman named Clara Holt, who had decided in the end that Wyoming in general and Sweetwater in particular was not where she intended to spend her life, and had gone back east, and that Monroe had not shown serious interest in any woman since. Helen had filed this information in the part of her mind where she kept things she was not going to allow herself to act upon, alongside things like the particular quality of his voice when he was amused, and the way he had of listening to someone speak with his full and undivided attention, as though whatever they were saying was the most important thing happening in that moment. She was not, she told herself, in a position to be interested in Monroe Lockhart. She was a woman with a complicated and scandalous past who had come to Sweetwater specifically because no one knew her name, and the last thing she needed was to attach herself to anything or anyone here in a way that would require her to explain herself. She was planning to be careful. She was planning to be sensible. She was planning to keep her situation simple. She was also, as it turned out, not very good at following her own plans when she was in the same room as Monroe Lockhart. The thing that broke her careful neutrality, or began to break it, happened 3 weeks after her arrival, on a Wednesday evening in April, when a man came into the Sweetwater boarding house in a state of agitation that made Mrs. Donahue come out from behind her desk with her hands already moving. His name was Roy Prout, and he was a homesteader from about 12 miles south who had ridden in that afternoon to deal with a dispute over his land claim, a dispute that had apparently escalated during the day to the point where a man named Cutter Dines, who was known in the territory as someone who acquired land through means that technically fell within the law while being entirely hostile to the spirit of it, was now threatening to file a competing claim against Roy's property on the basis of some alleged irregularity in the original filing. Roy Prout was not a sophisticated man. He was a farmer with a family, with a wife and 3 children, and he had filed his homestead claim in good faith 4 years ago and built his life on it. And now someone with more money and more lawyers was trying to take it from him, and he did not know what to do. He had gone to the land office that afternoon. Monroe Lockhart had gone through the original filing with him, had sent a telegraph to the territorial land office, had spent 3 hours working through the documents, and had told Roy that his claim was valid, that the irregularity Cutter Dines was citing was a technicality that had already been remedied in territorial law, and that he would put a full written legal opinion in Roy's hands by morning that would stop any competing claim cold. Roy Prout had come to the boarding house because Monroe boarded here for supper, and Roy wanted to thank him in person. He had stood in the parlor doorway with his hat in his hands and told this story to anyone who was present, including Helen, who was sitting near the window working on the household accounts. Monroe had accepted the thanks with a quiet directness that was neither false modesty nor performance, just the plain acknowledgement of a man who had done what needed doing because it needed doing. After Roy left, the parlor had settled back into its usual evening rhythms, and Helen had returned to her accounts but found herself unable to concentrate, and when she had looked up, Monroe was watching her from across the room with an expression she still couldn't fully parse, but that made the back of her throat go tight. "That was a kind thing," she said. "It was the right thing," he said. "Those are not always the same." "No," he said, "they're not." Something had opened between them in that moment, some channel of understanding, and Helen had felt it and had looked back down at her accounts and had told herself for the 40th time that she was not in a position to let this become anything at all. April had gone on. The Wyoming spring was warming, the land opening up out of winter with a particular energy that felt almost violent in its abundance, everything green and insistent. Helen had grown more comfortable in Sweetwater, had learned the rhythms of the town, had begun to feel the particular small ease of a place that was becoming familiar. She had also been unable to maintain her careful distance from Monroe Lockhart, because proximity in a small frontier town made distance a project that required constant active effort, and she had other things to do. They had begun to talk in the evenings at supper. Not exclusively to each other, because the boarding house table was communal, and the conversation moved through everyone at it. But there were threads of conversation that ran between them specifically, observations they made to each other about the day, about the territory, about the books they were reading. Monroe had a library of perhaps 40 books in his office, which was considered extravagant in Sweetwater, and he lent them without ceremony to anyone who asked, and Helen had begun to ask, and they had begun to discuss them, and she had found his mind to be one of the most interesting things she had encountered in the Wyoming Territory. He was not a simple man. He had been to school, had studied land law in Colorado, had read widely in history and natural philosophy, and thought carefully about things, and had opinions that he held with conviction, but without the rigidity that so often accompanied conviction in men of his time. He listened when he was wrong. He changed his mind when evidence required it. He laughed at himself with an ease that Helen found almost startling, because she had not known many men who could do that. She had begun to look forward to the evenings. She had begun to notice the days when he did not come to supper. She had begun to catch herself thinking about things she wanted to tell him, conversations she wanted to have, questions she wanted to ask. This was the hidden danger she had not prepared for. She had been prepared to resist attraction, the surface thing, the way a man looked or moved or held himself. She had not been prepared for the much deeper thing, the way two minds could find each other and recognize something, some complementary frequency, and vibrate at it. She had not been prepared for Monroe Lockhart to be interesting. And then, in the middle of May, her dark past had arrived in Sweetwater, and everything had shifted. His name was Everett Marsh, and he had been Gerald Fitch's attorney in St. Louis, which made him, in Helen's estimation, one of the men most implicated in everything Gerald had done, because you did not serve as attorney to a land fraud operation without knowing what you were serving. Marsh had somehow managed to emerge from the collapse of Gerald's schemes without legal consequence, which Helen attributed to his particular skill at positioning himself adjacent to illegality without technically crossing the line that mattered in court. She had not known he was coming to Sweetwater. She had not known he had any reason to come to Sweetwater. But he arrived on a Tuesday afternoon stage, checked himself into the boarding house, and came down to supper that evening, and Helen had looked up from the table and gone cold all over in a way that was purely the body's response to threat. He had recognized her. Of course he had. He had paused in the doorway of the dining room for just a moment, the barest hesitation that only she would have noticed, and then he had smiled the particular smile of a man who has just discovered an unexpected card in his hand. He sat across from her. He was cordial. He addressed her as Mrs. Leland. He said nothing that could be called improper or threatening. And yet everything he said carried a second meaning that she could hear clearly, that he had come to Sweetwater on business related to land claims, and that he was pleased to encounter her, and that she should not be surprised if their existing acquaintance proved relevant to his purposes here. Helen had gotten through supper through the sheer force of the discipline she had built over 2 years of living in a ruined situation, the ability to keep her face composed when everything underneath it was chaos. She had excused herself early, gone upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, and methodically worked through what she knew. Everett Marsh was a lawyer who worked in land. Sweetwater had a land office. Monroe Lockhart ran the land office and was known for his honesty. An honest land officer was a potential obstacle to someone who made money in land through methods that required the looking the other way. And Everett Marsh knew that Helen had a secret, knew that her name attached to Gerald Fitch's, knew that she was here under circumstances of deliberate obscurity. She had understood within 20 minutes that Marsh's presence in Sweetwater was not a coincidence, and that whatever business he intended to do here, her presence was going to be part of his leverage. The question was against whom and toward what end. She had found out the next morning. Marsh had gone to the land office first thing, and she had known this because she had positioned herself at Mrs. Donohue's front desk near the window with a clear sightline to the land office door, and she had seen him go in at 8:30 and come out again at 11, with the particular tight-shouldered walk of a man who had not gotten what he wanted. Monroe came to supper that evening, and he was quieter than usual. He sat at the table and was polite, but the quality of his attention was turned inward, working on something. Helen waited. After supper, when the other boarders had drifted to the parlor or to bed, she found him still at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold in front of him. "What did Marsh want?" she said. He looked up. She had not been subtle, she knew. She had simply asked the direct question and let the weight of it stand. "You know him," Monroe said. "I know who he is," she said carefully, "and I know what kind of law he practices." Monroe turned the cold cup in his hands. "He wants me to certify a series of land transfers at a valuation that I cannot honestly certify," he said. "He claims the properties were independently assessed. The assessments he brought me are fraudulent. I recognize the surveyor's name on 2 of them, a man who has sold his credentials to the highest bidder for at least 5 years. What properties? 3 homestead claims along the South Fork of the river, he said. Small holders. People who have been there 3 to 5 years. Marsh is acting as attorney for a land-holding company out of Denver. They want those properties and they are trying to create a paper record that will allow them to challenge the original homestead filings. Helen sat down across from him without asking. The dining room was empty. The lamp burned between them. He is going to threaten you, she said. Monroe looked at her steadily. Has he said something to you? Not directly. He does not need to say things directly. He dealt in implication for years in St. Louis and he was very good at it. She paused. He knows things about me, about my former husband. If he uses that to discredit me with Mrs. Donahue, I will lose my position here. Monroe's expression had changed. The careful, measured quality of it had shifted into something more present, more alert. Tell me, he said. She had not told anyone in Sweetwater. She had come here specifically so that she would not have to tell anyone. But she looked at Monroe Lockhart across the lamplit table, and she made a calculation that she had not made in 2 years. A calculation about trust, about who had earned it through the evidence of their actions rather than the promise of their words, and she told him. She told him about Gerald Fitch, about the land fraud, the investment scheme, the families who had lost everything. She told him about the collapse and about Gerald's disappearance, and about 2 years of rebuilding a life in the wreckage of a scandal she had not created. She told him about Marsh's role as Gerald's attorney, about why his presence here frightened her. She told him all of it, sitting straight and steady and watching his face for the particular blankness that had been her constant companion in St. Louis, the withdrawal of regard that came when people decided she was too connected to something shameful to be worth their goodwill. It did not come. Monroe listened. He listened the way he always listened, with his full attention and without the small sounds of judgment that people often inserted into other people's stories to signal their own moral position. He listened until she was finished, and then he was quiet for a moment. You did not know, he said. It was not a question. It was the plain statement of someone who had assessed the evidence and reached a conclusion. I did not know, she said. Then you were a victim of the same fraud as the families who lost their money, he said. The difference is the nature of what was taken from you. Helen had not thought of it in those terms. She had thought of herself as tainted by association, guilty of a naivety that had damaged others even without her intent. To hear it framed as victimhood was disorienting, like being told a room had a different shape than the one you had memorized. What Marsh intends, Monroe said, is to use the threat of exposing your history to pressure me into certifying his fraudulent documents. If I certify them, he has a paper trail that gives his clients a legal basis for challenging the homesteads. If I don't, he makes your name toxic in Sweetwater. Yes, Helen said, and he is betting that I will choose the path of least resistance, Monroe said. Either because I want to protect myself from the trouble or because I want to protect you. The particular phrasing of that last option hung in the air between them. Helen looked at the cold cup of coffee. Monroe looked at the lamp. What are you going to do? She said. What I do with any fraudulent document, he said. Refuse to certify it. File a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office about the assessments. And make sure Roy Prout and every other homesteader along that South Fork knows what is coming at them so they can get proper legal representation. And the threat regarding me, Monroe met her eyes. There is no version of this, he said, where I do what a dishonest man tells me to do in order to protect my own comfort. If Marsh wants to tell people about your former husband, he will tell them. What he tells them will be true, and what is true is that you are a woman who was deceived by a dishonest man and survived it with more integrity than most people manage. Helen had been in difficult situations before. She had held herself together through things that required considerable resources of the self to endure. She was not, as a general matter, someone who broke down easily. She came very close to it, right then, in the lamplight of Mrs. Donahue's empty dining room. She did not break down. She kept her spine straight and her voice level, and she said, "Thank you, Monroe." "Don't thank me for doing the right thing," he said. It was the same thing he had said about Roy Prout, and she understood that it was not false modesty. It was the way he actually thought about his own actions. Everett Marsh had remained in Sweetwater for 6 more days. He had been, during those 6 days, precisely as subtle and as threatening as his particular brand of menace required, speaking carefully with certain people in town, letting it become known through the sideways channels of frontier gossip that Helen Leland was not who she appeared to be, that she had a connection to a St. Louis scandal that people in the know were aware of. The scandal had not landed the way Marsh intended it to. This was due in part to the fact that Sweetwater in 1882 was a town full of people who had complicated histories, who had come west precisely because the East had become untenable, and who therefore had considerably more tolerance for past difficulties than the St. Louis society that Marsh was accustomed to deploying his information against. It was also due in part, Helen suspected, to Monroe Lockhart. She could not prove this, and he said nothing to her about it, but she was quite certain that he had spoken to the right people in the right way, that he had let the full shape of her situation be understood by those whose regard mattered in Sweetwater before Marsh's version could take hold. Marsh had left on a Wednesday morning stage without his certified documents and without having achieved anything in particular. Monroe had filed the formal complaint. Roy Prout and the other homesteaders along the South Fork had retained a lawyer in Cheyenne. The Denver Land Company's challenge had been folded before it reached anything official. Helen had watched the stage take Marsh away with a feeling of release, so profound it was almost physical, and then she had gone back inside and sat at Mrs. Donahue's front desk and tried to understand what she felt about Monroe Lockhart, who had not asked anything from her in return for any of it. What she felt was something she had no proper word for. Gratitude, yes, but that was the smaller part of it. The larger part was something that had been growing for weeks, a recognition, a pulling toward, the particular sensation of wanting to be near someone not because they were impressive or attractive or useful, but because they made you feel more like yourself, more like the best version of the self you were still trying to recover. She had not said any of this to him. She was still not saying any of this to him, through May and into June, while the Wyoming summer came on warm and dry and the territory opened up under the long blue sky. She had not said it because she was afraid. This was the truth she kept most carefully from herself, and therefore the truth she knew most clearly. She was afraid. She had trusted her own judgment about a man once, and that trust had been catastrophic. The fact that every available evidence suggested Monroe Lockhart was the opposite of Gerald Fitch in every significant way did not, for the frightened part of her, constitute sufficient proof that she could trust her judgment this time either. So she had said nothing. She had continued to have supper and to talk about books, and to notice everything about him with the sharp attention of someone keeping careful records. And he had continued to say nothing, to be present and careful and watchful with those gray eyes that saw more than he ever commented on, and the weeks had gone by. It had been Mrs. Donahue who had finally, in her blunt and affectionate way, said the thing that no one else was saying. "You are planning to leave," Mrs. Donahue had said one morning in late June, not looking up from the bread she was making, as though the statement was simply a piece of information she was adding to the existing inventory of facts. "My cousin Adeline has been asking me to come to Cheyenne," Helen said, which was true. "There may be a better position there." "There may be," Mrs. Donahue said. "Or there may be a very good reason to stay right here, if you would stop being so stubborn about it." Helen had measured flour and said nothing. "That man comes to supper 3 evenings a week," Mrs. Donahue said, "and he does not come for my cooking, which is adequate but not notable. He comes because you are here, and he has been working up to saying something for about 6 weeks, and if you leave before he manages it, I expect neither of you will forgive yourself entirely." He has given me no indication that he intends to say anything, Helen said. Men of that particular type, Mrs. Donahue said, do not indicate. They deliberate. He is the most deliberate man I have encountered in 20 years of running a boarding house, and I include the judge from Laramie who took 4 months to decide whether he wanted his eggs fried or boiled, and then chose scrambled. Helen had gone back to the flour. But she had thought about what Mrs. Donahue had said all through that day and the next several days, thought about the deliberate quality that Monroe brought to everything, thought about whether that quality was something she could count on or whether it was simply the presentation of someone who had nothing in particular to say. She had watched him more carefully after that. And what she had seen, looking with the specific intent of seeing rather than the general intent of not seeing too much, was that Mrs. Donahue might be right. There were small things. The way he noticed when she had a headache before she mentioned it and quietly arranged that the supper conversation did not become boisterous. The way he had lent her his copy of a Darwin text she had mentioned wanting to read and written, in the very light pencil he used for land documents. A small note in the margin of a passage he had thought she would find interesting. Not a declaration of anything, just a small sharing of thought, but the kind of thing you only did for someone whose mind you were paying close attention to. The way, on an evening when the news had come through that a woman in the north part of the territory had been attacked by men trying to run her off her homestead, and Helen had gone pale and quiet at the table, Monroe had sat beside her afterward, not speaking, just there, in the particular way that was more comforting than most speech. She had almost said something. Several times she had almost said something. And each time she had stopped herself because the calculus of what she stood to lose if she was wrong still outweighed, in the frightened corner of her chest, what she stood to gain if she was right. And then Adeline had written again, more urgently this time, about a position in Cheyenne managing the correspondence and accounts of a larger establishment, a hotel, good wages, good situation, and Helen had thought, if I do not go now I will never go, and if I never go it is because I am waiting for something that may never be offered, and I cannot wait again the way I waited inside Gerald Fitch's life, passive and hoping, and discovering too late that I had given my life over to an illusion. So she had told Mrs. Donahue she would be leaving. She had written to Adeline. She had arranged the northbound passage. She had packed the trunk and the 2 carpet bags, and she had carried them down to the front hall and set them there. And then she had gone to the window of the front parlor and looked at the road north. Monroe had been in the front parlor when she came down with the 2nd carpet bag. He had been standing near the window with a book he was not reading, in the particular way of someone who had arranged to be somewhere, without entirely acknowledging to themselves that the arrangement was deliberate. Helen had set down the bag. She had looked at the open door and the wagon outside and the road curving north, and she had heard herself say it. I know you are not asking me to stay. And then he had said the thing that changed everything. Then I am asking now. Helen turned around and he was standing with his hand against the doorframe and the expression on his face that she did not yet have a word for, and she looked at him for a long moment while the wagon waited and the road waited and the whole of her life seemed to pause on some edge. Why now? She said. Why this moment, Monroe? Because there have been other moments. Yes, he said, there have been. And you said nothing. No, he said. I didn't. He came away from the doorframe and crossed the room to her, not quickly, deliberately in the way he did everything, and stopped about 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw and the way his breath was careful. I lost someone to this territory once before, he said. Not to death. To the simple fact that she decided it was not the life she wanted, and she went back to the life she wanted, and I had said things and invested things and built things in my mind that I then had to dismantle. And I decided after that I would be more careful. I would not say things until I was certain. Until I was more certain than feeling, which fades and reforms, but certain in the way that comes from watching someone over time and knowing. And now you know, she said. I have known for weeks, he said. I have known since the evening in the dining room when you told me about Gerald Fitch, and you sat there with your spine straight and your voice steady, and you looked at me with those eyes waiting for me to withdraw from you. And I did not want to withdraw from you, Helen. I wanted, for the first time in a very long time, to move towards someone. She felt the truth of it in him, the unperformed, undisplayed truth of a man who was not given to performance saying the thing that was simply and completely real. There is still the matter of my past, she said. People in Sweetwater now know about Gerald Fitch. Marsh saw to that before he left. People in Sweetwater now know that you were deceived by a dishonest man, and that you rebuilt your life with considerably more courage than most people are called to demonstrate, Monroe said. If there is anyone here whose regard hinges on that information, it is not anyone whose regard is worth your concern. And you, she said, your reputation in this territory is built on your honesty. You are the land officer. You certify documents and you survey properties, and everything you do rests on people trusting you. A connection to Gerald Fitch's widow, even a wife who knew nothing, even an innocent party, is not something I am afraid of, Monroe said. I have lived my life according to what I actually believe, not according to what is convenient. If that changes the moment it costs me something, then it was never a belief. It was a performance. Helen looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about fear, about what she had let fear take from her in the last 2 years, and what she had let it take from her in the 6 weeks in Sweetwater when she had been within arm's reach of something real, and had kept herself carefully out of arm's reach of it. She thought about what it cost to choose against yourself in the name of caution and call it wisdom. She thought about the fact that she was 28 years old and had rebuilt herself from rubble and crossed a continent to start something different, and that different was standing in front of her in a gray-eyed, deliberate, deeply honest man who was asking her to stay. If I stay, she said, I stay because it is what I want, not because you asked. Do you understand the difference? Something shifted in his expression then, the tension of not knowing giving way to something softer and more certain. I understand the difference, he said. It is the only version of staying that I would want. She took a breath. She let it out. Then I will stay, she said. The wagon left without her trunk that afternoon, Helen having paid the driver the inconvenience of unloading it back into the front hall, which the driver accepted with the philosophical equanimity of a man who had seen many more improbable things in the Wyoming Territory. Mrs. Donahue, who had observed the entirety of events from the vicinity of the kitchen doorway with an expression of profound personal satisfaction, said nothing about it at all except to ask whether Helen would be at supper, and when Helen said yes, Mrs. Donahue nodded once and went back to her kitchen. Monroe had walked back to his land office. He had stopped at the door and turned back to look at her, and she had been standing on the boarding house steps with the afternoon light on her and the sage-scented air around her, and he had looked at her with that expression she had finally found a word for: tenderness. Not the performed kind. The kind that was simply present in a person when another person had become indispensable to them. She had given him a small nod. He had put his hat on and gone into the land office and closed the door. She had gone inside and sat at Mrs. Donahue's front desk and opened the accounts ledger and held the pen over it for perhaps 5 minutes without writing anything, simply allowing herself to feel, without immediately classifying or containing it, the specific and unprecedented warmth of having been chosen by someone she had already chosen. The summer of 1882 moved through Sweetwater with the particular quality of Wyoming summers: long days of strong light and wind, the land immense and various around the small human settlement, the sky a theater of weather that performed itself without regard for audience. Helen had settled more deeply into the work at the boarding house, had expanded Mrs. Donahue's record-keeping system into something more comprehensive, had begun helping with the correspondence to suppliers and to the territorial authorities, and had found that the work was genuinely satisfying in the way that work was satisfying when you were good at it, and it needed doing. Monroe had asked her, the day after she stayed, if she would walk with him on Sunday morning, and she had said yes. That Sunday walk had become a fixture. They went out along the Sweetwater River while the town was still quiet, the morning cool and clear, the cottonwoods along the river making their particular summer sound of leaves in the wind. They talked the way they talked at the supper table, but without the other people, without the careful geography of a communal space, in the looser and more honest way of people who are in the process of becoming known to each other. He told her about Colorado. Not all of it at once, but in the way that the real shape of a person emerged over time through the accumulation of stories and observations, and the specific candor that came with trust. He had grown up in Denver, had studied law at an institution in the East, had come back west because the West was where the actual work was happening, the land work, the territory work, the business of marking the land into parcels and establishing who had rights to what in a way that was fair and legal and didn't simply reflect who had the most power. He had worked in Colorado for several years, had built a reputation, had met Clara Holt in Denver, and had believed they wanted the same life. "I was not wrong about her," he said one Sunday, standing at the edge of the river where it ran shallow over smooth stones. "She was honest about what she wanted. She wanted the East. She thought she could want the West because she wanted me, and she tried for 2 years, and in the end the trying was honest too. She told me directly when she had decided. I respect her for that." "But it was painful," Helen said. "It was," he said. "The painful part was not losing her. It was the period before she told me, when she was struggling to decide, and I could feel that something was wrong and I did not know what it was. The not knowing. The gap between what I could feel and what I could name." Helen understood this with a specificity that made her chest ache. "I know that gap," she said. "I know you do," he said. He picked up a flat stone and held it, not throwing it, just holding it, looking at the river. "After she left, I decided I would not let myself enter that gap again. I would not let myself want something I could not see clearly." "And yet you let yourself want something in Sweetwater," Helen said. He turned and looked at her. The morning light was sideways and golden on his face. "Yes," he said, "because what I could see was already more than clear." They had walked back along the river with the distance between them that was natural for people who had not yet moved past a certain point. And yet everything in the way they moved was already different, already oriented toward each other in the way that revealed what the situation actually was to anyone paying attention. The first time he had taken her hand was in August, on a Sunday walk when they had gone further than usual, up into the foothills where the land tilted and became more dramatic, the sage giving way to scrub pine, and the view opening out behind them over the basin in a way that stopped the breath. She had been navigating a loose section of trail and he had simply been there, his hand extended, and she had taken it, and they had climbed the last steep section and then stood at the top looking out over the enormous Wyoming afternoon, and when the terrain leveled out, he had not let go and she had not removed her hand. It had felt like the simplest thing in the world. It had also felt like the most significant thing she had done since deciding to stay. They had stood there for a long time with their hands linked, not speaking, looking at the land. She had been aware of every point of contact between her hand and his, the warmth of his palm, the slight roughness of his fingers from the outdoor work, the particular quality of the way he held her hand, which was firm and present but not constraining, which was, she had thought, exactly the quality she had been trying to identify in him since she had arrived in Sweetwater. He did not constrain. He was beside her, not in front of her, not above her, not managing her. He was beside her and he was paying attention and he was honest, and these were things she had not known she was searching for because she had not known such a combination was findable in a man. She had looked up at him. He had been looking down at her, and in the simplicity of that exchange, with the Wyoming summer all around them and the river in the valley below and the enormous sky above, she had understood what she felt with a clarity that no longer required protection from itself. She was in love with Monroe Lockhart. The understanding had not frightened her. That was the thing that surprised her most later when she looked back at it. She had expected fear, the old reflex, the braced-for-impact quality that had governed her internal life since Gerald. But what she felt instead was something closer to recognition, the sensation of arriving somewhere she had been moving toward and having the landscape confirm that this was the right place. He had not said it yet, the specific words, and she had not said them yet either, and there was a particular sweetness in the period before the saying, the period of knowing without it being named, of carrying something privately that was already mutual and shared and needed no ceremony to be real. The ceremony, when it came unexpectedly in September, on a plain Tuesday evening in the boarding house parlor when most of the other boarders had gone to bed. Helen was reading by the lamp. Monroe was sitting across the room with the accounts ledger she had asked him to look at, a question she had about some land transaction records that intersected with her work for Mrs. Donahue. He had been quiet for some time with the ledger, and then he had set it down and he had looked at her. "Helen," he said. She looked up from her book. "I love you," he said, not with preface, not with the circumlocutions that men of that era and that social order often deployed when approaching a declaration. Just the words, plain and direct and delivered in his particular voice that was neither loud nor soft but simply level and real. She lowered the book. She looked at him across the lamplight. "I know," she said. And then, because it was equally true and equally worth saying plainly, "I love you," he smiled. Monroe Lockhart smiled, and it was not the small, dry smile of his wit or the quiet, controlled smile of social grace, but something fuller and less contained, something that reached his eyes and changed his whole face into something she wanted to look at for a very long time. He crossed the room. He sat beside her on the settee where she had been reading, and he took the book from her hands and set it on the table and held both her hands in both of his. And they sat there in the lamplight of Mrs. Donahue's parlor in Sweetwater, Wyoming in the autumn of 1882, and it was as simple and as enormous as that. He had asked her properly in October, with the cottonwoods along the Sweetwater River going gold and the air carrying the first edge of the coming winter. He had asked her on their Sunday morning walk, stopped on the river path, turning to her with the gravity he brought to things that mattered. "I want to marry you," he said, "if that is what you want. I am not asking you to want it because I do. I am asking you what you want." The distinction mattered to him, she knew. He had said it before, in other contexts, that he would not want her to do something because he wanted it if she did not want it herself. This was one of the ways he had remade her understanding of what a partnership with a man could look like. "It is what I want," she said. "Monroe, it is what I have wanted for longer than I have been comfortable admitting." "Then we agree," he said, which was perhaps not the most romantically conventional acceptance of an acceptance, but it was so precisely himself that she had laughed, and then he had kissed her for the first time, standing on the Sweetwater River path with the gold leaves falling around them, and the kiss had been like everything else about Monroe Lockhart, deliberate, present, entirely sincere. They had married in November, in the Sweetwater Church, which was a small wooden building that served as church on Sundays and as a meeting hall for the rest of the week, and the whole town had come, because in a small frontier settlement, the marriage of one of its most respected figures was an event for everyone. Helen had worn the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool that she had bought in St. Louis in better times and had kept through everything, and Monroe had worn a suit that had been pressed by Mrs. Donahue with considerable ceremony. Roy Prout and his wife had attended. The judge from Laramie, who happened to be in Sweetwater for other purposes, had officiated with a warmth that suggested he found the occasion genuinely pleasing. Helen had looked at Monroe across the narrow aisle of that small wooden church and thought about everything that had brought her here. The ruined marriage and the damaged name and the long frightened journey west and the boot caught in the muddy rut of a Wyoming street and 6 weeks of supper tables and Sunday morning walks and a man who listened the way other men breathed, like it was simply what you did. and she had thought that she was not someone who believed in the mechanisms of fate. But she believed in the accumulation of choices, her choices and his, and the aggregate of all those choices was standing in a church in Wyoming in November 1882 with her hand in his hand and his eyes on her face. "I do," she said, when the moment came, with more conviction than she had ever said anything. "I do," Monroe said, looking at her with that expression that was now entirely familiar and entirely necessary to her, steady and warm and real. They had moved into Monroe's house after the wedding, a two-room structure on the edge of town that was more functional than decorative but well-built and solid, which was what Monroe thought about when he built anything. Helen had brought her own order to it immediately, her organizational sensibility, her particular aesthetic of clean surfaces and good light, and within a week it had become a home rather than a bachelor's quarters. She had continued working for Mrs. Donahue in the mornings, which Monroe had supported without reservation, because the work was good work and she was good at it, and the idea that a woman should abandon something she was good at and that she valued was simply not a calculation Monroe made. The Wyoming winter came down hard in December, the way it always did in the high country, with the wind that came off the mountains and the snow that could arrive fast and deep. Helen had been born in Missouri, and the winters she had known were different in kind, less dramatic in their arrival, less total in their imposition. Wyoming winter was a presence in the landscape, forceful and requiring, and she had spent the first weeks of it learning to move within it. Monroe taught her the practical things without condescension: how to read the sky for the particular quality that preceded a blizzard, how to manage the stove for a house where the temperature could drop severely overnight, how to walk in snow-packed streets without repeating the muddy street accident of her first week in Sweetwater. He was a good teacher because he taught by doing alongside rather than by explaining from above. In the evenings they sat by the stove and they read and they talked, and sometimes they played cards, and Helen discovered that Monroe was a poor card player with a tell she identified in the second game, and used against him ruthlessly for the rest of the winter, which delighted them both. She also discovered, in those winter evenings, things about Monroe that the public context of the boarding house and the land office had not revealed. He was quietly funny in a way that surprised her still, even having known about his dry wit. He had opinions about poetry that were strong and unexpected, very much in favor of Emily Dickinson, with reservations about Longfellow that he expressed with such specificity that she had started calling him Longfellow's greatest critic, which he had accepted as an accurate description. He snored with a gentle consistency that she found, against all reasonable expectation, comforting rather than disruptive. He also, in those winter months, showed her the thing she had perhaps needed most: what it was to be with someone through the ordinary difficulty of daily life without the drama of it, without crisis as the measure of the relationship. The crises had shown her who he was, Marsh and the homesteaders and the moment at the door with the wagon, but the winter showed her the endurance of it, the way what was true about Monroe Lockhart was true every day, not only when something was at stake. In February, she told him she was expecting. She had waited until she was certain enough to be certain, and she told him on a Sunday morning when the snow was coming down outside in the particular silent way that Wyoming snow came down, soft and total. He had gone very still. This was not Monroe being reserved or controlled. This was Monroe being moved in a way that exceeded the ordinary channels of his expression. He had stood in the kitchen where she told him with the coffee pot in one hand, and he had gone still, and then he had set down the coffee pot and he had come to her and he had put his arms around her very carefully, as though she were suddenly more fragile than she had been 30 seconds ago, which she was not, but she allowed it because she understood what the gesture was carrying. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. "Extremely," she said. He had held on for another long moment, and then he had stepped back and looked at her with that face, and there was something in it that was new, something she had not seen before, a depth of feeling that the reserve of him usually held back at some level, breaking the surface now, fully visible. "I am very happy," he said, quietly and with complete sincerity. "I know," she said. "So am I." She had written to Adeline in Cheyenne with the news. Adeline had written back with such exuberant congratulations that Mrs. Donahue, who had been handed the letter to read, had laughed so hard she had to sit down. The spring came back to Sweetwater in March with its usual intention, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes, the river running high and fast with snowmelt, the sage greening up through the brown of the previous year. Helen had watched the spring come from the window of the house she shared with Monroe and felt it as something personal, the particular renewal of a season that matched what was happening inside her own life. She had continued at Mrs. Donahue's until May, when the physical realities of the pregnancy made the daily walk and the long hours of desk work more than she wanted to sustain. Mrs. Donahue had replaced her with a young woman newly arrived from Iowa, whom Helen had trained herself with considerable thoroughness, because if a thing was worth doing, it was worth doing properly. Monroe had hired a woman from the south part of town to help with the household work as Helen's condition progressed, a practical arrangement that Helen had agreed to without the reservation she would have felt 2 years ago, in a life where asking for help had felt like evidence of deficiency. She had learned, in Sweetwater in this life with Monroe, that asking for and accepting help was simply an honest acknowledgement of how people actually functioned, in community rather than in isolation. The baby came in late August, in the thick of the Wyoming summer, with Mrs. Donahue present in the efficient and competent capacity she brought to everything, and with Monroe pacing the length of the front room with a contained anxiety that he was not entirely succeeding in containing. The baby was a boy. He was large and loud and entirely healthy, and Helen had held him in the aftermath of the long hours of labor and looked at his face, which was very red and very new and quite insistent about its presence in the world, and had thought that the journey from St. Louis, the whole broken, frightened, determined journey from the ruins of one life to the beginning of another, had arrived somewhere that she could not have imagined when she was sitting above the milliner's shop in 2 rooms, being looked at like a problem. Monroe had been allowed into the room after Mrs. Donahue had determined that everything was in proper order, and he had come in quietly and stood by the bed and looked at Helen first, with the assessment of someone who needed to confirm that she was all right before anything else could proceed. When she had given him the small nod that told him she was, he had looked at the baby. Helen watched his face. She would think about what she saw there for the rest of her life, the particular arrangement of a man's features at the exact moment something changes everything, the way the reserve of Monroe Lockhart was simply not adequate to contain what he was feeling, the way it showed clearly in his eyes and in the line of his mouth, and in the particular slowness with which he reached out to touch the baby's hand. "A boy," Helen said. "A boy," Monroe said, his voice rougher than usual by some measure that she noticed, and that told her everything about the quality of the moment. "I would like to name him James," she said, "after my father." Monroe looked at her. "James," he said. "Yes." James Lockhart had entered the world with his father's gray eyes and his mother's determination, and he had been from the first days of his life both loud and deliberate about his opinions, which Monroe observed with a dry amusement that suggested he recognized certain qualities. Sweetwater in the years that followed had grown. The town expanded through the mid-1880s as more homesteaders arrived, as the cattle routes solidified, as the infrastructure of civilization accumulated in the way it did on the frontier, tentative at first and then with increasing permanence. A proper school was established, a second church, a telegraph office that allowed communication with Cheyenne and Denver, and eventually the wider world with a speed that still struck Helen, raised on letters that took weeks, as somewhat miraculous. Monroe's land office had expanded too, taking on a second surveyor and eventually an assistant who handled the correspondence, while Monroe managed the legal and regulatory dimensions. He had been offered, in 1885, a position with the territorial government in Cheyenne, a senior land commissioner role that would have come with considerably more authority and considerably more money. He had brought the offer home to Helen one evening and laid it on the table between them the way he laid all significant things, without predetermined conclusion, open to examination. Helen had read the letter twice. She had thought about Cheyenne, which was a growing city with proper streets and established society, and the kind of institutions that were already fully formed rather than in the process of forming. "What do you want?" she asked Monroe, which was the same question he had asked her in October 1882 on the river path when he proposed, and which was, she had come to understand, the question he asked before any other, about any significant matter. "I want what is good for our family," he said, "and I want to keep doing work that is honest and that matters. Both things are possible here and both things would be possible in Cheyenne." "James knows Sweetwater," she said. "He knows Roy Pruitt's children and Mrs. Donahue and the Sweetwater River. He is happy here." "He is 3 years old," Monroe said with a slight smile. "He will adapt with remarkable speed and without lasting difficulty." "You do not want to go," Helen said, reading him. "You are trying to be neutral about it, but you do not want to go." He was quiet for a moment. "I built something here," he said. "I mean that literally. I know the land. I know the families who have claims and what they need and how to help them keep what is rightfully theirs. If I go to Cheyenne, I become an administrator. The work is important, but it is different in kind." "Then we stay," Helen said. He looked at her. "You are certain Cheyenne would offer you?" "I do not require Cheyenne," she said. "I have what I require. I have what I want. I am not leaving Sweetwater for a position." He had written back to Cheyenne declining with thanks, and had never, as far as Helen could determine, regretted it. The summer of 1885 also brought news that Helen had been carrying a complicated relationship with for 3 years. Gerald Fitch had been found. Not found in any beneficial sense. He had been living under a different name in New Mexico Territory, and had been discovered when he attempted a variation of his original scheme in a smaller and less sophisticated market, and it had collapsed in the same way the St. Louis scheme had collapsed, except that this time he had not escaped before the legal consequences caught him. He was in federal custody and would be tried for fraud. Helen had heard this from Monroe, who had received word from the Territorial Land Office as a professional courtesy, given his past involvement in documented Fitch-adjacent fraud through the Marsh matter. She had sat with the information for a day. Gerald Fitch had been a fixed point in her understanding of her own story, the defining catastrophe, the central wound. Now he was a man in federal custody in New Mexico Territory, reduced from catastrophe to fact. She had thought about the families in St. Louis. She had thought about the women in particular, wives and mothers who had lost their savings and their security and their sense of the world, as a place where trust was possible. She had written 2 letters, to contacts she still had in St. Louis from her earlier life, asking about the status of the victims of the fraud, whether there was any restitution process underway, whether there was anything she could do from the distance of Wyoming to support those who had been harmed. The response had come back that yes, there was a federal process for restitution from whatever assets of Gerald's could be recovered, and yes, any documentation from a credible source about the scope of the fraud would be helpful. Helen had written a formal statement, detailed and precise, about everything she had observed during her marriage, every transaction she had knowledge of, every conversation she could reconstruct with specificity. Monroe had reviewed it for her, not editing its content but making sure its legal language was as effective as possible. She had sent it to the federal attorney's office in Missouri. The acknowledgment that came back 6 months later, thanking Mrs. Helen Lockhart for her contribution to the case, had been the specific moment when she felt the last weight of Gerald Fitch lift from her. She had done what she could. The rest was in the hands of the law and the justice it could manage, which was imperfect but real. She had told Monroe about it that evening, reading the acknowledgment letter at the supper table while James banged a wooden spoon against his cup in the particular percussion of a 3-year-old who had opinions about the table's acoustic potential. Monroe had read the letter. He had handed it back. "Well done," he said. It was precisely enough. In the spring of 1886, Helen was expecting again. This time she told Monroe earlier, because she knew more now about how to read her own body, and because there was no longer the uncertainty of the first time, the need to be certain before she could speak. Monroe had not been less moved. He had set down whatever he was holding, which this time was a land survey map, and he had come to her and put his arms around her with the same careful intention as before, and she had felt his breath slow and deepen in the particular way that told her he was settling into something enormously important. The second child arrived in October 1886, on a day when the aspen on the hillsides were full gold, and the air was clean and cold. A girl this time, with Helen's dark hair and Monroe's watchful gray eyes, and they named her Catherine, which was Monroe's mother's name, given without ceremony or prompting on his part, just offered the evening after the birth quietly as one of the possible names if Helen thought it was suitable. Helen had thought it was more than suitable. She had thought it was everything. James, 3.5 years old and highly interested in the new situation, had inspected his sister with the concentrated seriousness of someone conducting a formal assessment, and had then announced that she was acceptable, which Monroe had received with the dry expression of a man trying not to laugh. Mrs. Donahue had been present for the birth again, and had declared Catherine the most composed newborn she had encountered in 20 years of assisting at births in Sweetwater, which Helen rather suspected was simply generosity, but appreciated nonetheless. Mrs. Donahue had retired from running the boarding house that same year, handing it over to the Iowa woman Helen had trained, and had settled into a comfortable semi-retirement that mostly involved visiting people and maintaining opinions about everything, which she did with undiminished energy. The house Monroe had built, the 2-room structure on the edge of town, had grown. He had added rooms as the family required them, with the same practical competence he brought to the land surveys, each addition solid and well-made, and fitted to the needs of the people inside it. By 1887, it was a proper house, with a kitchen separate from the main living space and 3 bedrooms and a front porch where Helen sat in the evenings when the weather permitted and watched the sky do what Wyoming skies did, which was to be enormous and various, and never the same 2 evenings in succession. Monroe sat with her on the porch in the evenings when the work allowed it, which was most evenings. They had the conversations of people who have built a life together and are deeply interested in each other's minds, which was the form their love had taken from the beginning and continued to take, the intellectual and the intimate twined together in a way that made each more vivid. James started school in the fall of 1887 at the proper school that Sweetwater had established. He was a serious and somewhat intense child who had his father's capacity for sustained focus and his mother's directness, a combination that his teacher reported as both highly effective academically and occasionally challenging socially, which Monroe and Helen had found privately very funny and had taken turns being appropriately grave about when discussing it with James. Helen had returned to working when James started school, not at Mrs. Donahue's boarding house, which was now under different management, but in a different capacity. A lawyer had established a proper practice in Sweetwater by 1886, a man named Thomas Garrett who had come from Kansas, and who had immediately recognized in Helen Lockhart someone with both the intelligence and the practical knowledge of legal documentation to be genuinely useful in a frontier law office. She had begun doing document preparation and correspondence management for Garrett's office 2 mornings a week, and it had expanded from there. It was work she was good at, and that mattered in the same way Monroe's work mattered, the particular importance of helping people navigate systems that were complicated and consequential. She had helped homesteaders file their papers correctly, helped families understand their legal situations, helped women who came in with complicated domestic situations find what legal options existed for them. And she had brought to all of it the particular empathy of someone who had navigated difficult legal and social terrain herself, and knew how terrifying the paperwork of your own life could be. Monroe had watched this expansion of her professional life with the same straightforward support he had always given her work, the uncomplicated assumption that her having meaningful work was simply good and required no particular negotiation. In 1888, the summer before Catherine turned 2, there had been a moment that Helen had afterward marked as the point at which she fully understood the distance she had traveled from the woman who had arrived on a stagecoach in Sweetwater in the spring of 1882. She had been walking back from Garrett's office on a Thursday afternoon, and she had passed the stage stop where the northbound stages came through, and a woman had been standing there with 2 carpet bags and a trunk, newly arrived, with the particular look of someone who had just traveled a long way and was trying to determine whether they had arrived somewhere that was going to be all right. Helen had stopped. She had looked at this woman who was perhaps 25, with a set to her jaw that was recognizable, the specific combination of determination and fear that she knew from the inside. She had walked over. The woman's name was Dorothy Crane. She was from Illinois. She had come west after a situation at home that she was not immediately forthcoming about, which Helen understood and did not press. She was looking for the boarding house. Helen had taken her there. She had introduced her to the new proprietor with a warmth and a specific recommendation that she knew would ease Dorothy's way. She had told Dorothy, standing on the boarding house steps before she left, the thing she wished someone had told her in those first days. "Sweetwater is a good place to start over," she had said, "not because it is perfect, but because the people in it have mostly had to start something over themselves at some point, and they remember what it is to need a chance." Dorothy Crane had looked at her with those frightened and determined eyes. "Thank you," she had said. "Come to supper," Helen had said. "I eat with my family in the evenings, but any evening you feel the need for company, you are welcome." Dorothy had come. She had come twice in the first week, and after a month she had found work as a seamstress, and after 6 months she had found her feet in the way that people did when they were given enough space, and enough time, and enough small kindnesses to allow their own considerable resources to reassert themselves. This was the specific thing that Helen had taken from her own experience and had made into something outward. The knowledge that what she had needed in the worst of it was not rescue, but witness, someone to see her accurately and treat what they saw with respect, and the knowledge that she could be that for other women who arrived in Sweetwater in need of the same. The summer of 1889 brought Wyoming statehood, or nearly. The Wyoming Constitution was drafted that summer, and in November Wyoming was admitted to the Union as the 44th state. Helen and Monroe had attended the celebration in Cheyenne, making the journey with James, now 6 years old and full of questions, and Catherine, who was 3 and had to be carried on Monroe's shoulders for most of the proceedings but who retained her opinions about everything throughout. Statehood had changed some things and left others intact. The land law framework Monroe worked within became more formalized, which in practice meant more paperwork and more communication with state authorities, which Monroe managed with his usual methodical competence. Helen's work with Thomas Garrett's office expanded again, Garrett having developed a particular trust in her capacity to manage the increasingly complex documentation that statehood brought. Helen was 35 in 1889, and she felt more solidly herself than she had at any earlier point in her life. Not more comfortable, though she was comfortable, more present, more certain of who she was and what she believed and how she intended to move through the world. The frightened, carefully contained woman who had arrived in Sweetwater 7 years ago existed in her memory with a clarity and a compassion, But she was not that woman any longer. She was Helen Lockhart. She was Monroe's wife and James's, and Catherine's mother and Thomas Garrett's most capable document specialist, and Mrs. Donahue's dear friend and Dorothy Crane's first friend in Sweetwater, and a figure in the life of the town who was known for competence and honesty, and a particular directness in conversation that people either found refreshing or startling, depending on their prior acquaintance with women who did not soften their views. Monroe was 41. The gray of his eyes had spread to his temples and threaded through his dark hair in a way that suited him, the particular distinction of a man aging well, which he was, with the same steadiness with which he did everything. The land office had become an institution under his care, not simply a functional bureau, but a place where people knew they would be treated honestly and helped effectively. And this was Monroe's legacy in Sweetwater in the practical sense, the daily sense that mattered more than any formal recognition. He was also, in the daily life of their home, the specific thing that Helen had not known she needed and had found, a man who paid attention. Not the performance of attention, not the intermittent attention of someone who was present when it suited them, but the steady, genuine, full attention of someone who was interested in another person's life as an ongoing fact. He asked her what she thought. He listened to what she thought. He disagreed when he disagreed and explained why, and listened to her disagreement in return. He told her what he felt with a directness that had grown more, not less, as the years had established safety between them. On their anniversary in November 1889, 7 years into their marriage, he had given her a letter. Not a gift in the conventional sense, not a piece of jewelry or a household item of some kind, though he had given her those things on other occasions without any awkwardness about it. A letter, handwritten in his precise surveyor's script, that was a complete accounting of what the years had been to him, what she had been to him, in the specific and unhyperbolic language of a man who chose his words because they were accurate rather than impressive. She had read it at the kitchen table while he was outside with the children. She had sat there for a long time after she finished it, with the letter in her hands and the Wyoming November visible through the window, the land gray and brown and vast and beautiful, and she had thought that she would keep the letter for the rest of her life, which she did, folded in the cedar box where she kept the things that were too important for any other storage. In 1891 they had a third child, another boy, arrived in the easy April of a mild Wyoming spring, and they named him William, which was Monroe's father's name, offered by Helen this time with the same quiet certainty that Monroe had offered Catherine's name. William was a round and cheerful baby who became a round and cheerful toddler, and showed early signs of his mother's organizational capacity in the precise way he arranged his own small possessions, which Monroe observed with an expression of pure delight. James, by 1891, was a serious 8-year-old reading well above his age and beginning to ask the kind of questions about history and justice that made Monroe take him on Saturday mornings to the land office and show him the actual documents, the homestead filings and the survey maps, and explain what they meant and why they mattered, which James received with an intensity of attention that Monroe found both moving and entirely familiar. Catherine at 5 was a different species of child, more kinetic and social than her brother, with a circle of friends she managed with a diplomatic skill that Helen found both impressive and slightly alarming in someone so small. She had her mother's directness and her father's capacity for long focus, but in her, these qualities expressed themselves through people rather than through documents and ideas, and she was already, at 5, someone who made the rooms she entered more alive. Helen turned 40 in 1894. Sweetwater had grown considerably by then, a proper small city rather than a frontier settlement, with a newspaper and a bank and a doctor's practice, and a proper school with multiple teachers and eventually a high school, and the particular sense of a place that had decided to become permanent. The land office had 2 full-time surveyors and a clerk by 1894. Monroe had the title of Senior Land Commissioner for the county, a formal recognition of what had been functionally true for a decade. Helen had left Garrett's office the year before to open, with Thomas Garrett's enthusiastic support and a small amount of capital they had accumulated over the years, a small documentation office of her own, specifically focused on homestead filing and land claim support, filling the same need she had always been filling, but under her own direction. It was not a grand enterprise. It occupied 2 rooms above the newer mercantile, and it employed, eventually, 2 other women whom Helen had trained, women with similar histories of having to navigate difficult circumstances with considerable capability. But it was hers, built from her knowledge and her skills and her judgment, and it was doing something necessary, and she was proud of it in the plain and uncomplicated way of someone who has made something good. Monroe had come to see the office on the day she opened it, standing in the doorway of the 2 neat rooms with their organized shelves and their clean desks, and he had looked at her with that expression, the tender, fully present one, and he had said nothing at all for a moment. Then he had said, "Well done." She had given him exactly the same expression back. James was 15 in 1898 and already clear about what he intended to do with his life, which was to study law, not because his father had studied law or because there was any familial pressure toward it, but because he had grown up watching his father and his mother both navigate the legal systems that governed the land and the people on it, and he had decided early that this was where he wanted to put his efforts. Monroe had written letters to legal programs in Denver and in Cheyenne. Helen had written letters too, letters that drew on the professional relationships she had built over 15 years of working in frontier legal practice. James had gotten a place at a Denver institution, starting in 1900 when he would be 17. The planning had occupied the family through 1898 and 1899 in a productive way, the particular forward-looking energy of a household preparing to send someone out into the world. Catherine, 13 in 1898, had observed her brother's preparation with a thoughtful attention that Helen recognized as her own early tendency to watch and assess before committing. She had not yet said what she intended, and Helen did not ask, having learned from her own life that the question of what you intended needed to be answered from the inside rather than under external inquiry. She would know when she knew, and until then she was learning everything she could from every direction available to her. William at 7 was still round and still cheerful, and had added to his organizational tendencies a remarkable interest in the natural world, specifically in the birds and the plants and the geological formations of Wyoming, which he pursued with a methodical record-keeping that had Monroe quietly delighted and Helen not surprised at all, having recognized in him very early the particular shape of a future naturalist. The winter of 1899, going into the turn of the century, was one Helen would later describe to her grandchildren as the winter she felt the full weight and the full gift of everything that had accumulated in 17 years of life in Sweetwater. She was 45. Monroe was 47. James was 16 and home for his last winter before Denver, and they had long and serious conversations in the evenings that ranged from law to history to the politics of land rights and the question of what statehood had and had not delivered for the people who had built Wyoming, conversations that Monroe entered as a fully equal participant without any of the condescension toward young people that she had observed in other men of his generation. Catherine was 14 and reading everything she could find and beginning to write, in private notebooks that she did not yet share, which Helen knew about without ever asking to see them, respecting the privacy of a young person's forming thoughts. William was 8 and had just begun keeping a proper naturalist's journal with entries of considerable seriousness for his age, illustrated with drawings of birds and plants that showed both real observation and growing technical skill. On a January evening of that winter, with snow coming down outside and the stove warm, and all 5 of them gathered in the front room in various states of reading and working and drawing. Helen had looked up from the letter she was drafting for a homestead client, and looked at this room, and these people, and this life. Monroe had looked up at the same moment, catching her looking, and the exchange between them was brief and entirely understood, the shorthand of 2 people who had been paying close attention to the same life for 17 years, and who both, in that moment, were aware of its extraordinary particular quality. He had gone back to his papers. She had gone back to her letter. But the warmth of that exchange had stayed in the room for the rest of the evening. James had left for Denver in the fall of 1900. Helen and Monroe had taken him to the stage in Sweetwater, and Monroe had shaken his son's hand and held it for a moment, and Helen had held her son close, and they had watched the stage go north toward Cheyenne and the train that would take him west, and Monroe had put his arm around her on the stage stop platform, and she had leaned into him in the way she had learned she could, fully, without reservation, knowing with absolute certainty that he was there. "He will be fine," Monroe said. "He will be extraordinary," Helen said. They had walked home through the October afternoon, through the Sweetwater that had been her home for 18 years, past the land office and the boarding house and the mercantile and the church where they had married, past the spot on the main street where she had caught her boot in a muddy rut, and looked up into gray eyes that were conducting a rapid assessment of whether she was hurt. She had thought, walking home through the October light, about that woman on the stagecoach in the spring of 1882. She had thought about what that woman had been carrying, the fear and the damaged name and the secret hope, and the absolute, necessary courage of someone who had decided to go forward anyway. She had wanted to tell her something. She had wanted to tell her, "You are going to make it. Not just survive, though you will survive, you are very good at surviving. You are going to build something real, something honest, something that is fully yours. You are going to find a man who is worth the finding, and you are going to love him in a way that gets bigger rather than smaller over the years, and you are going to have a life in Wyoming that you cannot currently imagine, and that will exceed anything you think you are hoping for." She had not needed to tell her. That woman had found all of it herself, through her own choices and her own courage, and here Helen was on the other side of it, walking home with Monroe Lockhart's arm around her, and the vast Wyoming sky above, and the whole of her life solid and real and present around her. They had a letter from James in November, settling into Denver and finding it larger than he had anticipated and more interesting than he had expected, which was James, honest about what surprised him, open to what he found. He was studying well. He had met several interesting people. He had opinions about the professors that he expressed with a thoughtful precision that made his mother hear, in every line, the shape of who he was becoming. Catherine had begun, in 1901, to share some of what she was writing with her mother, not all of it, selectively, with the specific quality of someone who was testing reception. What she was writing was good, genuinely good, with an eye for detail and an ear for voice that Helen recognized as real, and she had told Catherine so directly, and without the kind of cushioning qualification that a woman who did not believe the assessment might add. Catherine had received this with a seriousness that told Helen it mattered enormously, and that the privacy of the notebook had been about protecting something fragile until she knew it was real. Monroe had read what Catherine shared with a quiet attention that he gave to all things, and had said to his daughter afterward that he thought she had his mother's eye for what mattered, which was the highest praise he possessed, and which Catherine understood immediately. William in 1901 was 10, and his naturalist's journal had become something approaching a serious scientific document, with systematic observation records and careful taxonomic notes that their doctor, who had some scientific education, had declared impressive, and had begun lending William books from his own library to support the work. In 1902, Monroe had been asked again about a governmental position, this time at the state level, a senior role in the Wyoming State Land Board that had been established in the years since statehood. He was 54, and the offer was from men who knew his work and valued it, and the role was the kind of thing that was both a recognition and a genuine opportunity to affect land policy at a scale that exceeded what he could do from Sweetwater. Helen and Monroe had sat with this one longer than they had sat with the Cheyenne offer in 1885. The situation was different. The children were older, Catherine 16, and managing her own life in Sweetwater with increasing independence, William 11, and embedded in a web of local knowledge and naturalist relationships that were genuinely formative. The offer was serious and the opportunity was real. They had talked about it over a series of evenings with the particular quality of conversation they had developed over 20 years, honest and thorough, neither avoiding the difficult aspects nor dramatizing them. "I think you should take it," Helen had said eventually. Monroe had looked at her. "Tell me why." "Because the work you have done in Sweetwater for 20 years is the proof that you know how to do this larger work honestly," she said. "Because the people who will be affected by good land policy in Wyoming are people like Roy Prout, and you are the person who understands what Roy Prout needs from a land policy. And because you have given Sweetwater 20 years, and you have given it everything you have, and you have changed it for the better, and there is a next thing. And your practice," he said. "My practice is established. Margaret and Louise know what they are doing, and I have built it to run well. Margaret and Louise were the two women she had trained and employed. I can take the client relationships with me to Cheyenne and build the Cheyenne side and keep Sweetwater running as a satellite. The homestead work does not stop at the county line." Monroe had been quiet for a moment. "You would leave Sweetwater." "I have lived in Sweetwater for 20 years, Helen said. "I built something here and I am grateful for everything it has been. But I have never been someone who needed a particular place to be at home. I need the right people." She looked at him. "Those come with me." He had accepted the position. The move to Cheyenne had been in the summer of 1902, after James had come home for the summer and helped them pack and had then returned to Denver, and after Catherine had been settled into the arrangements for her remaining time in Sweetwater with the family of a friend, which she had organized herself with the domestic competence she had been developing since she was 8. William had been the most ambivalent about leaving, but Cheyenne had the Wyoming State Museum and a community of naturalists connected to the university, and within 6 months of arriving, he had found his people and his projects, and his ambivalence had evaporated. Cheyenne was larger and louder than Sweetwater, with the particular energy of a state capital, political and various and ambitious. Helen had found it interesting after 20 years in a smaller frame, had found the expanded scope of what she could do professionally genuinely stimulating. She had established the Cheyenne branch of her documentation practice in the first months, connecting with lawyers and homesteaders and the various state offices that their work touched, building new relationships from the foundation of her 20-year reputation in the territory. Monroe had gone into the state land board work with the same methodology he had brought to everything, thorough and honest and systematic, and within a year was one of the most consequential voices in Wyoming land policy, the person in the room who understood both the law and the actual human reality of land claims and homestead life, because he had spent 20 years making that understanding his work. James had graduated from Denver in 1904 and had taken a position with a law firm in Cheyenne, which meant that, for the first time in 4 years, the whole family was in the same city, a situation that Helen found deeply satisfying. James at 21 was very much himself, serious and precise and quietly funny, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's directness, and he had settled into Cheyenne's legal community with a competence that made Monroe and Helen observe each other across the supper table with the parental equivalent of that look they had exchanged in the January firelight in Sweetwater, the full acknowledgement of something extraordinary. Catherine, 18 by 1904, had come to Cheyenne and had enrolled in a teacher's program, the best available education for a woman of her time and inclination, though Helen suspected that what Catherine would ultimately do with her life would exceed the frame of any single category. She was already, at 18, someone whose presence in a room changed it, who wrote with a clarity and power that deserved a larger audience than she had yet found, who thought about justice and education and the lives of women in the frontier West with a specificity and a passion that was entirely her own. Monroe had said one evening, watching Catherine engaged in an argument with James about some aspect of territorial history, that he thought their children were considerably more interesting than they deserved. Helen had said she thought they deserved exactly what they had, and Monroe had smiled the full smile that she still loved to see on his face, unchanged in its quality from the one that had first appeared in Mrs. Donahue's lamplight 22 years ago. In 1906, when Helen was 52 and Monroe was 58, James had married. Her name was Sarah Whitfield, and she was the daughter of a Cheyenne banker, and she was smart and warm and had met James at a civic meeting where he had been making an argument about land rights, and she had waited until he finished and then made a better argument, and they had been together from that point, which Helen had received as the most appropriate possible origin story for her son's marriage. Helen had welcomed Sarah into the family with everything she had, with the full and genuine warmth of a woman who understood what it meant to be welcomed into a family when you were uncertain of your reception. And Sarah had recognized the quality of the welcome, and had loved her mother-in-law with a clear-eyed and grateful affection that Helen found purely lovely. Monroe had received his son's marriage with the grave and tender quality he brought to things that moved him deeply, and had told James the night before the wedding, quietly and directly, that he was very proud of the man James had become, and James had been very still for a moment, and then had said, "Thank you, Monroe," in a voice that carried everything he did not have additional words for. Helen and Monroe had danced together at James's wedding, at the reception in a Cheyenne hotel, on a floor full of people celebrating, and she had looked up at him over the years and the distance of the dance and thought about the morning she had spent in Sweetwater waiting for a northbound stage with a trunk and 2 carpet bags, and the man who had stood in the doorway of the boarding house and said, "Then I am asking now." She had stayed. The enormous rightness of having stayed filled her completely in that moment, warm and certain and abiding as anything she had ever felt. "What are you thinking?" Monroe said. "I am thinking about the wagon," she said. He understood immediately. He always understood immediately. "So am I," he said, and held her closer, and they danced in the Cheyenne hotel while their son began his life. And Helen Lockhart was 52 years old and as happy as she had ever been, and she intended to be happier still. William, 22 in 1907, had begun formal publication of his naturalist's work, contributing papers to scientific journals that were received with the respect that real observation and careful methodology earned. He had a position with the Wyoming State Geological Survey, doing exactly the work he had been preparing for since he was 8 years old with his first systematic bird journal, and he moved through the world with the particular ease of someone who has found their vocation and found it real. Catherine at 21 was teaching in a Cheyenne school and writing in the evenings and sending articles to the Cheyenne newspaper under her full name, which was Catherine Monroe Lockhart, the Monroe being her middle name, chosen deliberately for the byline because she wanted it there. The articles were about education and about the rights and conditions of women in Wyoming, and about the specific injustices that she had grown up watching her mother work against in the quiet and practical way of someone doing the daily work rather than making grand statements. And they were good. They were genuinely good. And they were being read and talked about in a way that suggested Catherine Lockhart was a voice that Wyoming was going to have to pay attention to. Helen had read every article and had felt each one with the specific pride of a mother watching her child do something the child was genuinely meant to do, and also with the broader recognition of someone seeing her own work continued and expanded in the next generation. Monroe had retired from the State Land Board in 1910, at 62, with the particular satisfaction of someone who has done the work they were suited for until they could no longer do it more good, and then stopped. There had been acknowledgments, a dinner, a formal letter of commendation from the state governor that said things about his contribution to Wyoming land policy that were accurate and deserved, and that Monroe had received with the same quality he had received all recognition, quietly and without particular emphasis. Helen had looked at the governor's letter and then at Monroe and had said what she thought about it, which was that it was correct but insufficient, which was the nature of official language when applied to the kind of work that lived in the daily particulars and could not be fully summarized. He had agreed, and they had set the letter in the cedar box beside the anniversary letter and gone to supper. Helen had kept her documentation practice going past Monroe's retirement, scaling it back as her own energy directed, but keeping the threads of it alive because the work still needed doing, and she still knew how to do it. She had given more of the daily management to Margaret, who was now running the Sweetwater office independently and had been for years, and to a capable young woman in the Cheyenne office named Vera, and had moved herself into the advisory and mentoring role that was the natural evolution of 25 years of accumulated expertise. James had a son in 1908, named Thomas after his grandfather on Sarah's side, and a daughter in 1910, named Eleanor. Helen's grandchildren arrived with the particular surprise of a new generation, the specific delight of watching your children become parents and recognizing in their small children the traces of the people you have known your whole adult life. Thomas, a serious dark-haired boy, had Monroe's watchful quality and the habit of observation. Eleanor, born with the particular insistence of a second child who knows the territory, had Sarah's warmth and James's intelligence, and a laugh that she deployed with infectious generality. Monroe with grandchildren was a revelation that Helen had not anticipated precisely, though she should have. The careful, deliberate quality that he brought to adult relationships became, with children, a kind of focused play, entirely serious in its engagement, but without the weight of consequence. And James's children had discovered early that their grandfather would sit on the floor and answer questions about rocks and birds and land surveys with complete seriousness for as long as they wanted to ask them, which they found ideal. Helen, in her late 50s and early 60s, was a woman of considerable presence in Cheyenne, known in the legal and civic community as someone whose judgment was worth having, and whose willingness to involve herself in matters of justice was both reliable and effective. She had been part of the movement for women's suffrage in Wyoming, which the territory had granted in 1869 and statehood had preserved, and she had worked in subsequent years to make that formal right a practical reality for women in the areas where it was still obstructed by custom and social pressure. She had not done this loudly or with large gestures. She had done it in the way she did everything, practically and precisely, case by case, person by person, using her networks and her knowledge and her 40 years of understanding exactly how the official systems worked and where they could be made to work better. Catherine had written about it. Had written about her mother specifically, though Helen had asked her not to, and Catherine had listened to the request and then written the piece anyway, because she said what her mother's work represented was more important than her mother's modesty, which Helen had found both aggravating and entirely correct. Monroe had read Catherine's piece about Helen's work and had been quiet for a moment, and then said that Catherine had gotten it exactly right, which was both the most supportive thing he could have said and a highly effective way of ending Helen's objections to the piece. He was not wrong, which was the problem. Monroe Lockhart, at 65 in 1913, was a man who had done the work of a life and done it well, and who wore that fact with the same plainness he wore everything. He was silver-haired and still lean, still had the watchful quality of those gray eyes, still had the particular quality of presence that had stopped Helen in the doorway of the Sweetwater boarding house 31 years ago. He had developed, in retirement, a habit of long morning walks that William had pointed out, on a visit from his Wyoming survey work, followed the same routes as the Sunday morning walks he and Helen had taken along the Sweetwater River in the beginning, which Monroe had confirmed was not coincidental. Helen walked with him when she was not occupied with work, which was most mornings, and they moved through Cheyenne the way they had moved through Sweetwater, in the easy conversation of people who have been paying full attention to each other for a very long time and who are still interested in what the other person is going to say. She had asked him once, on one of those morning walks, whether he had regrets. Not in the sense of catastrophic wrong turns, but in the smaller sense of paths not taken, possibilities that had been visible and passed by. He had considered the question with his characteristic deliberateness. "I regret," he said, "that I let 6 weeks go by in Sweetwater without saying what I intended to say. It was my fear dressed as my caution, and you nearly got on a wagon to Cheyenne." "I would have gotten on that wagon," she said, "and then I would have gotten off it in Cheyenne and eventually found my way back to something. Women do that." "You would have found your way to something good," he said. "You are that kind of person, but it would not have been this." "No," she said, "it would not have been this." They walked in the morning light. "And you," he said. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything, without the comfortable distortion of hindsight that made the difficult parts smaller than they had been. She thought about Gerald Fitch and the years in the rubble of that mistake. She thought about the boarding house in St. Louis above the milliner's shop. She thought about the stagecoach across the territories and the cold spring mud of a Wyoming street. "I regret that I was afraid for so long," she said. "Fear is useful in the right quantity, and it cost me too much in the wrong quantity. But I do not regret any of the choices that brought me here, because they all brought me here, and here is where I have been most myself, most alive, most fully what I actually am." Monroe reached across and took her hand in the way that he had taken it first on a Wyoming hillside in August 1882, with the same warm, firm grip, the same quality of being present and not constraining. They walked home through the morning. In 1915, William published his first full book, A Natural History of Wyoming Flora and Fauna, that drew on 30 years of systematic observation, and that was received by the scientific community with the serious attention it deserved. Monroe and Helen attended the small celebration dinner that James and Sarah hosted for the occasion, and Helen had sat at the table with her 3 grown children and her daughter-in-law and her 2 grandchildren, and looked at Monroe across the length of it and thought, "This is it. This is what all of it was for and what all of it has been. Not for something. Simply itself, whole and real and present." Catherine had married in 1914, a man named Robert Hale, who edited the newspaper where her articles appeared, which was both the most obvious and the most apt possible romantic connection. 2 people who cared about the same things coming together over the work they both loved. Helen had liked Robert immediately, and with increasing conviction the more she knew him. Liked that he listened to Catherine with the same full attention that Monroe had always given her. Liked that he understood what Catherine was doing and regarded it not just without resentment, but with genuine admiration. Monroe had shaken Robert Hale's hand at the wedding with the specific quality of a man who has assessed someone thoroughly and reached a satisfactory conclusion. Catherine and Robert had a son in 1915, which they named John, and Helen had held her second grandchild and thought about the cedar box at home with the anniversary letter and the governor's commendation and the federal attorney's acknowledgement about the Gerald Fitch case. And she had thought that she would add to that box, at some point, a letter to this child, to all her grandchildren, the things she wanted them to know that could not be conveyed in any single conversation. She had written it that fall, sitting at her desk in the Cheyenne house while Monroe was on his morning walk. She had written about fear and about courage, and about the specific importance of paying attention to the evidence of who a person actually was rather than who you wished them to be. She had written about work that mattered and about the difference between safety and comfort, which were not always the same thing. She had written about love, about the particular love she had found with Monroe Lockhart, not as a model to replicate but as evidence of what was possible, what real attention and real honesty between two people could build over time. She had written, "You may arrive in a strange place with nothing but a trunk and a hope. You may find yourself in the mud in the middle of a street you do not yet know. If someone offers you a hand, take it honestly and look at the person offering it with clear eyes and trust the evidence of what you actually see." She had folded the letter and put it in the cedar box and closed the lid. Monroe had come back from his walk and had made coffee and brought her a cup without being asked because he always knew when she needed one, and she had taken it from his hands and looked up at him, and he had looked at her, and they had existed for a moment in the full and complete knowledge of each other, 33 years in the making, present and entirely real. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. Outside the window, Cheyenne moved through its day in the January light, and Wyoming spread out beyond it in all its enormous, indifferent, beautiful extent. The same land that had absorbed them both so many years ago, that had given Helen Leland a place to begin again and Monroe Lockhart a reason to stop being careful about wanting something. And that had been, for 33 years, the ground of a life they had built together, day by day, choice by choice, fully and honestly, and with their whole attention. Helen Lockhart was 61 years old. She was the happiest she had ever been. She intended to be happier still, and she had every reason to believe she would be, because she was with Monroe, and he was asking, and she had stayed.